As we manage our supply chain, we have to consider the impact of supply chain disruptions. For example, in England, they've been planning for the last couple of years for Brexit. That is, England would separate from the European Union in terms of being part of the trade partnership. So right now, England and members of the European Union have free movement of goods and people between countries. So what this means is that if you're bringing cargo or inventory between locations, there's not customs inspections, there's not itemized lists that have to go across, there's not additional tax and tariffs that have to be considered. Goods can move freely between nations. But as the United Kingdom leaves this trade agreement and they do Brexit, what that will mean is now for the flow of inventory or cargo to move between England and Europe, there will now be customs and inspections, and there can be taxes on that trade and the movement between materials between the countries slows down as it has to go through a number of ports of entry. So what impact does that have on the supply chain? Well, there's a number of companies, including Nissan, who moved to Britain in order to gain access to the European countries and the British markets. And so they've warned that because of Brexit, they may leave England and move to places like Germany. There's also been a number of banks who've made the same comments because they were in England to not only access the English market, but all of those European countries as well. And so some of those businesses will move. But we also have to consider that there are companies within Britain who produce goods for British customers, and they're being impacted because they buy their supplies from European nations. And so in anticipation of Brexit, what we have these companies rushing to stockpile some of their materials they will need in case, as they negotiate Brexit and then as we make the transition to separating England from that European trade agreement, that now materials will take longer to get across from Europe to England, and then there's going to be supply disruptions. So these factories are stockpiling. Well, the challenge with the supply chain disruptions is that when factories start to stockpile their materials, that means that once the supply chain is back up and running, they don't need to buy as much from their suppliers. And so it can create this bullwhip effect because the factories are going to buy huge quantities of inventory, and then for months they're not going to buy anything. Well, if you're the supplier, you then need to provide huge quantities right now, and then there's no one buying any of your materials for the next couple months. And so we swing from having way too much inventory to not enough. We can't meet customer demand. We get angry customers. We have back orders. And so then we have to order a bunch more once the supply chain has been normalized, is no longer disrupted, and then we're back to ordering large quantities, and then it swings back to now we have too much, and it takes a long while for it to stabilize. And so this can be quite problematic for companies because having to stockpile and buy large amounts of inventory is very expensive, but also when you run out and you don't have enough and you have angry customers and you're losing those customers, that can also be expensive as well. And so both swings or that we see within this bullwhip effect can be quite costly for companies. So this is true with Brexit and the impact it has on trade between countries. But we can also look at something like the GM strike and how it disrupts the supply chain. In this case, what we have is that GM provides, so production, the factory, and they provide vehicles to the dealerships. Well, dealerships have about 84 days of supply on hand. So a typical dealership would go through every vehicle in about 84 days. Okay, that's days of supply. Now, the GM strike that happened recently That will lasted for 40 days. And so when we look at a strike, it is a supply chain disruption because for 40 days, the dealerships are not getting any new vehicles to their location. Well, as that continues to draw out, then the challenge becomes, well, they're reducing that 84 days of supply, they're dwindling it down, but it's not being restocked. So a long strike can mean that a dealership doesn't have any vehicles to sell because of that disruption. Now, the other thing is it's not just the 40 days that GM was on strike. Because the strike continued to last for a couple days, then what happens is the suppliers who make the parts that go on GM vehicles, they had nothing to do because they can't provide more chassis, more engines to GM because the GM factories weren't running. So the challenge becomes, well, if you can't have your workers who are making the chassis and engines and other components that go in these vehicles, then they get laid off. So what happened here is that they laid off, some of the suppliers laid off their workers as they waited for the GM strike to end. Well, when the GM strike ended after 40 days, those suppliers then had to recall their workers and get their production lines back up and running in order to provide parts to GM to make the vehicles. And remember, the dealership all along has about 84 days worth of supply. So we have to take into consideration there was the 40 days of the GM strike, plus the extra week or two where it takes the suppliers to get back online, provide materials for GM to start producing more vehicles. And so you can have this ripple effect throughout the entire supply chain when you have a disruption at any point in that supply chain. So in these videos, we're going to look at supply chain management. Why do you need a well-managed supply chain? How do you choose your suppliers? And we're going to be looking more at the impact of that bullwhip effect on companies.